that have driven me? The questions that have driven me have always been the how questions, not the what questions. You know, it's the how questions. How do we change things? You know, we can say there's problems out in the world. We can say there are issues. But the real question for me is like, what do I do about it? How do I go about it? And just working in this field, as Josh says, for 20 years, that process question, that how question hasn't always been the one that people go, what's the issue? What's the problem? What's the situation here? But actually the thing that drives me is the how question. Changing the change system, changing the way we do things is kind of what's driven me. I won't go into all the places I've worked and the issues I've looked at, but I'm giving this context to sort of say I've worked on environmental issues, started at Stakeholder Forum, at WWF. So this is just the perspective I'm coming from. Jen's here, who started the Finance Innovation Lab. Many years ago, we worked together, worked in education, worked in public sector, worked with businesses on systems change, worked with foundations, set up coalitions and inquiries, and even field building activities. But the real work is actually with people, maybe online now or in parks, or even with your kids as well, you know? So the real work is doing it in the real world. And that really is the flavor that I'm gonna bring today, that I can show all these brands and ideas, but actually the work also happens in multiple settings and contexts. And it's really, how do we weave together that experience and those ideas and connect them and join the dots? So just to sort of put a bit of framing out there, a field is a particular branch of study or sphere of activity or interest. So including all the participants in the activity, and you are part of that field if you want to choose to be there or not. It is bounded, it has a boundary to it, but it might be a porous boundary. And I quite like the living systems metaphors, the field, like how do we understand a field in terms of crops or pastures or open land? But it's also bounded by hedges and fences, and what does that mean? But I'm also going to bring a spin today about the field of systems change. For me, is about the practice, the application of the use of those ideas. So that's the perspective I come from. Systems change and not systems thinking, but system thinking is part of it, but it's about what does that mean for us as a method, a way of doing something, a procedure. And that's the perspective I'll bring today. So where have we come from, or where have I come from? What's my view of the journey to here? And again, you might have a different journey. I can bring up, you don't need to read all of this. I'm just bringing up, there are multiple maps out there about the journey of systems thinking, of systems dynamics, of complexity science. You might have started in your own branch of one of these. Over time, you know, since the 1940s, the 70s, 80s, there's been different strands and ideas and connection points. We can spend a lot of time mapping them out. But I'm quite interested in what happened over the last sort of decade, over the last 5 years. You know, what has happened in that period? Where are we at the moment? I think there's been a shift from just systems dynamics to applying that to societal challenges. And Meadows was one of those people who really said, well, if I start thinking systemically, I've got to ask questions about what's happening in the world. I have to ask these questions, the environmental movement, you know, limits without growth, what she was saying there. We have, you know, the MIT lot looking at multi-stakeholder collaborations. How do we apply this to big businesses, to food systems, to ideas? And through the noughties, they were kind of looking at things like Theory U. And also design thinking, social innovation, transitions work, you know, IDEO, different labs emerging and work happening. So there's this shift from kind of just thinking in systems and thinking about the dynamics to where do we apply it? Do we apply it to issues, to collaborations, to design and innovation? And as such, we saw the growth in organizations starting to adopt it. Organizations saying, we need to do this, various applications and experiments in different settings. A lot of them don't get written about or seen. A lot of them are hidden away and they're not as kind of visible. And you see a lot of either consultancies or people trying to advise and support others to do this work. And that started to emerge over the last decade. And over the last 5 years, and I think I've been part of that, is the need for capacity building. So including our own, the School of Systems Change, in saying, well, actually, how do we bring this to others? It might not just be in consultancies or support, but how do we build the capacity of more people? And over the last 5 years, there's been an emergence of lots of different offerings in that space. And also reflections of what does it mean to be a field? It's almost like over the last 5 years, we've seen questions of, is this a field? What is the boundaries of it? How can we know it? What does it look like? And that's been one of my reflection areas as well. So as I say, 5 years ago, we set up the School of Systems Change to build capacity. So moving from, I used to run the System Innovation Lab at Forum for the Future, and we made that shift to say, well, yes, there's a lab and we want to explore our own methodologies, but we also want to help others to do that and to build their capacity. So we set up the school, running programs, but also building capacity of organizations and networks to do systems change work. And as such, we started to map out what are the frameworks of the field? What frameworks and tools and ideas are out there? So 5 years ago, and you don't have to look at the detail, I'll go through the next slide, but we just used Kumu and sort of said, what's there, what's out there? How can we understand the different frameworks? And as a consequence, we created sort of 5 capability areas, and you don't have to look at the detail, and we've never kind of gone back to it, and I'd love to have the time and space to kind of unpick it a bit more, where we said that there is tools and frameworks out there around systems dynamics. How do we understand systems? How do we think in systems? Futures methodologies, mapping methodologies, a whole systems thinking, even what's human-centered design contributes to that diagnostic. So how do we understand the problems and the issues? But actually, if we understand it, when we're talking about change work, we're actually talking about what's the strategy of change? How do we understand transitions? How do we understand transformations? How do we design for change or use social innovation? So there's sort of like, how do we start designing from that place of thinking in systems? And that then says, how do we implement? How do we collaborate, engage others, work with networks, stakeholders, innovate, scale, think about impact? And how do we look at the issues of learning and leadership and kind of like the process of who we are and how we lead and how we learn as a key thing. So these 5 different capability areas became the frameworks and the curriculum of the school. But it was trying to build and connect with people across the field of practice. And we also started to say, well, when we started to work with contributors on our programs and connect with people across the field, we kind of looked, there might be some core practices out there that we're kind of trying to integrate into our day-to-day work. So what are those core ways of thinking? And you could say habits of a systems thinker is very similar to that, but there was stuff in there as well about agency and power, about how we engage different perspectives, how we really work with the whole and at different levels, how we work with patterns and pattern thinking. So this is sort of where we've come from, where we've been. And as I say, at the school, we kind of use that as our approach to build courses and opportunities about lots of different tools, but really based in the practitioners, bringing them together of case studies and the practice of this. And this has also been the shift, I think, is really the focus on what does it mean to be practitioners in this field? You all as practitioners, how can we start looking at it? So where are we now? Where are we kind of at this moment? As you can see, I'm looking back, where are we now? And then I'll do the kind of where are we going, or what am I seeing on the edges as well? So we've had the pandemic, but we've also had this kind of, what I think is kind of rising above the parapet. Systems change is a word that we're starting to use. You see climate change march, systems change, not climate change, or end systemic racism, Black Lives Matter. It's almost like with the pandemic has also not come the ideas of just about health, but also about our environmental health, about our social health and inequality. And so for me, the word systems change is starting to be used a lot more in organizations. People are saying, oh, systems change, systems change. And the question for me is, well, what does that start translating to in practice, right? What does this mean that people are starting to use it and put it in their strategy documents, on their web pages? But are they following that up with practice? And I think it's a great call, but it's the question of what does this start to mean for the work that we do? And so beware, understanding of systems change is, this is my definition of the emergence of a new pattern. And people are calling for the outcome. I want to see a shift in that pattern. I want the outcome. Systems change, not climate change. I want to see that shift. But actually, the key thing is, what's the process by which we continually create change systemically? And that's the thing that I'm not seeing necessarily in these organizations adopting the term systems change. They're adopting the term, oh, we need to create systems change, but then they're still doing the same things in the same way. So it really is about practice. What's our practice in that process of operating and working systemically? So that's kind of where I think we are at this questions. And I've been involved with a few field building, the system innovation work here over the last 5 years, Catalyst 2030, Golden for Sustainability was something that happened about 10 years ago. We set up Illuminate. There have been others like Systems Play. Ashoka's been in this environment. Others are contributing maybe in smaller global areas in terms of who's starting to build a field to sort of ask the question of, okay, how do we really support and catalyze people in terms of bringing this practice to our work? And what I think we've been seeing as part of Illuminate and some of the questions is that some of this systems work is moving outside of academia. It's expanding capability and capacity building. It's about doing the work, the action inquiry, the learning of it. It's about the leadership and collaboration as well as the thinking. So this is the as well as the extending out. The role of funders and resourcing of change has been a massive question over the last few years. What's the role of foundations? How do we fund this work? How do we do this work? How do we resource it? Public sector funding as well. And we've been running something called Investors in Change, kind of trying to respond to that field level emergence question about where is the investment to do this work? How do we get the business? Jasmine and I were just talking about, like, what's the business model? How do we get this working? How do we, it's sometimes countercultural and the funding is not there. So this has been a question for us in this field. And there's also questions of who holds the knowledge. How are we centering equity and inclusion? We are in this room, I'm a white British woman speaking to a conference in London and saying, well, whose knowledge, whose ideas are these? Indigenous knowledge, there's naturally, I've just read Sand Talk, and I just finished that the other week and was like, they're thinking systemically. This is not a new capability. We're born as systemic practitioners. We know this. It's just a lot of our education systems has actually taken away the ability to be systemic. So is this just a Western-centered concept that it's new? Is this just because we've actually kind of taken out any of our systemic sensibility out of ourselves? And so what does that mean for a field that's developing when actually some people and some knowledge systems have been thinking like this for centuries? So as part of Illuminate, at the School of System Change with other partners at a Midyar network, we started to map out and do an affinity map of, okay, let's visualize the field. And this is very much that the connection points are not people who know each other. It's more affinity to the kind of work they do. And we use LinkedIn for this. So data issues awry, but it's still really interesting exercise to have a conversation. For me, mapping is always about what conversation you have as a consequence rather than purity of data. But we did this work with actually the founders of Kumu, and we started to look at, okay, how are people identifying themselves on LinkedIn as their skills, their practice, what this means when they identify as being in systems change. And the strongest area is actually people, a lot of them talked about leadership, facilitation, change management, and that's where I came from as a facilitator, the change word, and then you kind of bring in the systems. There's also work of justice, social justice, collaboration, multi-stakeholder collaborations, social innovation, yes, complexity and systems thinking and science, inclusion, action research and learning. So it sort of has, and social innovation as well in there. So lots of different practices and self-identifying ways that we communicate ourselves. And we're now going out to these people and inviting more people to give us kind of, okay, is your LinkedIn the way you want to represent it? Is that just for the market? Is it actually how you want to see yourselves? We're asking questions now. As I say, it's an inquiry, not a finished product. That's about how is the field seeing itself, and what does it mean when we start capturing and putting boundaries on it? Some of the insights is actually there's no one way to see systems change. It's not really a field, but a weaving together of multiple lineages. So it's kind of like, it's an ecosystem maybe. Is it really a field? What's its boundary? How do we see it? And our perspectives and ideas of where we come from will really affect that. The field is immediately bigger than we expected. People, we can't just say, oh yeah, we know the field, this is who we are. It's much bigger than expected. And it maybe is smaller than expected because some people are saying, I don't want to use that term. I'm quite happy with my feminist background and what I'm doing. I want to keep my niche. I want to keep what's happening here. So it's both bigger and smaller than expected. And it's got a danger of reinforcing the dominance in the field. How are we paying attention to the fact that it could just reinforce what we're seeing, that we're just reinforcing that westernized view, and the map is haunted. Who sees the map? Who isn't on the map? How can this map be a tool, not a weapon to say you're out of the field? So that's our inquiry questions going forward about as we're looking and engaging partners across Africa and Asia and asking a question of what does this mean from coming from an equity and diversity perspective. So how do we pay attention to these questions as we're mapping and understanding the field? So this leads me to the question of, okay, but what's emerging and what's on the edge? And I love edge questions. Edge questions is kind of the inquiry questions are the things that help us transform and move into new areas. So what I'm going to present now is sort of the bubbling under of myself and those I inquire with about what we might see as the edge of systems change practice, what I am seeing at the edge of systems change practice. And again, I can't wait to see your post-it notes to see how different they are. But this is just a stimulus for yourself in terms of what might be happening, what might this be for the progression or the edges, and some of it might become the dominant practices, some of it might stay at the edges, just like any living systems. What happens at the edge could create the big shift, or it could just stay there and die. And this is my map, which I did on Miro. I will take you through it. So I won't kind of divide it up, but it kind of started to look a little bit like an iceberg, to be honest with you, like what's on the surface and what's underneath. As I started to use a framework myself, I can't help myself, as I started to map my post-it notes out. And I thought about getting our learning curator to do a lovely image of it. And I thought, no, actually, this is a post-it, a working document. It's not something that is rarefied yet, because I want to keep the inquiry going and add your ideas and thoughts to this. So again, this is very much me and those I've been working with and where I'm coming from. And I can't wait to hear for those on Twitter or in the room, what's missing, what else is in there. The one thing I do want to start is the context. This is also about systems practice. You know, the world is burning, in my view. Climate change is heating up. The world is unequal. You know, there's huge injustices in the world. Inside the word emergency is emerge. From an emergency, new things come forth. The old structures are crumbling fast, but the danger and possibility are sisters. So yes, I think if we work with systems, we work with the idea of systems, I think we can't do that without seeing the whole and working with the whole. You know, like Daniela Meadows said, we have to kind of go out and zoom out to the biggest level. And any system analysis has to start paying attention to what's happening at that global level. What's happening at that global level, in my view, is, you know, we are outgrowing ourselves. We have created structures and systems that are causing runaway climate change, that are based on injustices and inequalities in the system. And that's what it means to think systemically, not just apply it into the boundary that you've got, is to keep asking that question of zooming out. I was working with some health practitioners yesterday, and they were going, oh, we're trying to look at how we get environmental practices into the healthcare system. And I was like, yeah, and is it a healthcare system, or what's the health system? You know, and they were thinking, and they hadn't, you know, they were going, oh, I didn't think of that. I said, just zooming out one layer of saying, well, what about the communities, the schools? I said, well, actually, this is about how climate change is affecting health. And they're like, oh, and they were just seeing it from the, how do we put in environmental ideas into healthcare systems? And we had a lovely conversation about zooming in and out. So how does systems work? You know, really pay attention to that broader context. So the world is complex, it's uncertain, it's unknown. That's just a statement I think we can sort of work with as part of complexity and systems work. The world is relational, dynamic, and is currently the relational dynamic is that it's unequal and unjust. And that's what I'm seeing. And the world is changing. And I think the pandemic has really helped us to kind of acknowledge that, you know, seeing change, we felt it. Although we're trying to pull back to what was, you know, there's also the resistance in the system of saying, let's go build back better. When actually, you know, did we really want to stay in that system? Do we want to change things? So this is the bigger context, that systems I think are collapsing. So again, this is the edge. There's other things happening, but what I'm bringing into systems change, these ideas in these post-its are what I'm bringing in as the things that we're starting to pay attention to. They're not the whole, they're the things I think we need to pay more attention to as we think of our practice. So collapsing systems is something that's more of a dialogue at the moment, not just building and scaling up and creating the new, but also thinking about what does it mean when things are collapsing, issues are heating up. So it's creating a growing acceptance of the need for system change, for deeper structural transformation, but it's also creating emotional issues of overwhelm, of grief, of hopelessness, of like, what do I do? So Anna told me, and that I've got to always think of climate change with every systems work I do. It's like, well, that's just too much, that's too big. So it's creating these emotional reactions as well. So what does that start meaning for our practice? And what does that start meaning of the things we are, and I see on the edges of we're paying attention to? So there's regenerative has become a word. This idea of regenerative sustainability, as I've worked in for 20 years, is not anymore. We're not just have the ability to sustain our systems. The systems around us are not functioning. So we need to regenerate or just generate our systems. And that in itself is a systems practice that is really coming into the field, the idea of regenerative practice. So for me, that is a new kind of part of our field now, not just talking about the systems thinking dynamic, but actually thinking about this in the context of living systems and regenerating, and how do we create healthy systems? What does this mean? And equity and justice, the practices of equity and justice and power dynamics and healing the systems as well is a critical part of what we need to pay attention to, we are paying attention to. We held something a few years ago in North America, and a lot of the themes that were coming out of capacity building for systems change was this concept of healing. You know, we've got a lot of injustice, so what are the practices of healing the systems as well? So I think this raises big questions about our practice and the field and what we need to be paying attention to. And for me, the real practices that are new, not new, but kind of shining more of a light on, becoming more important in the work of systems change. For me, I've used the word cultivating. My book's called Cultivating System Change. My PhD was that. And my team was actually called Cultivate for a while. But I think this is becoming the edgy work, the work that we really need to do more of and pay more attention to, the relational work, the people work. Power being a concept that we kind of say and we hold on the edge, but we need to push power dynamics. Because if systems change and systems work is all about relationships, then if it's all about people and social systems, then power dynamics is all about it. So how do we really step into that question of power? Who has the power? Where is power? How does power work between us? How do we work with that? And that requires us to do inner work. So the idea that systems change, you can change the system out there, but we don't need to change ourselves. No, we're all part of the system. We need to do our work. We need self-care. We need to see ourselves as part of the system. And that also has a role in the psychological, the emotional, the triggers. You know, I've been training recently in my facilitation skills as really understanding my deeper psychological patterns. So as I facilitate and I help transformation and deal with trauma and injustices, you can actually work with those questions and move into transformation. So these questions are becoming part, I think, of the field and are becoming more explicit, more part of what we need to do. It's not just about the analyticals, it's also about the deeper psychological work we need to do to help transformation. And this is asking questions about roles and identities. What are the different roles we need in the systems? We need the fighters, the people who want to break the system to help it collapse. We need the rebuilders, the people who want to facilitate and create the change. But I think we're seeing people identifying with different roles and having role fluidity as well, saying, I want to play a role in this, and not just saying I'm a systems changer, but saying, what kind of system changer do I want to be? What's my contribution? And this idea of, you know, identity is a massive issue also out there at the moment, but I think we're also seeing that concept of identity. Who do we identify with? How do I want to call myself a network weaver? Do I want to call myself, you know, a disruptor? How do I work with those different identities? And it really asks ourselves to work with diversity, to work with our deeper purposes as well. And I think, you know, I don't know if this is edge or new, or I just want it to be, or, you know, at the heart of this is the facilitative capacity. Because I really do think, and I'm feeling braver and braver to say, no, I really do think, and it came out of an inquiry we did called Boundless Roots, of the importance of the facilitative capacity in the change. So you might be a great person thinking systemically, but if you can't facilitate and help other people along the journey, actually we can all have these tools and approaches and frameworks, but at the core of them all is helping people work with those tools and frameworks, right? So helping them do the work, or just holding a space, just inviting people in. And I just don't think we're paying enough attention. I think it's on the edge and those questions are coming out. How do we organize for change? What is the governance, the decision-making? What's the enabling environment? How do we build movements or communities? Or how do we structure the way that we organize? Self-organizing systems. Reinventing organizations was kind of a pioneer in thinking the systemic way of doing that. All these things are part of the systems work of bringing in, how do we do this? How do we come together? How do we do this work together? So how do we cultivate this change? It's relational, it's social. This is the thing under the surface that kind of, I think we are and need to be paying more attention to. So what's the ongoing inquiry for myself, and kind of almost dropping down to the bottom of the iceberg, if I can keep using that as a bit of a metaphor here? For me, it comes back to the importance of worldviews and the underpinning narratives of society. What worldview coming from? So you might say, I'm thinking in systems, but where does that come from? What is the systemic view that you bring to this? In different contexts and geographies, that's happening in different ways. We've been having an inquiry with our Asian colleagues about what does this mean to take the school to Singapore and to India, and recognizing we don't want to just export the contributors we have in Europe. You know, that's not the way we want to do things. There are beautiful people working systemically in that context, but do they self-identify as working systemically? What does this look like? How do we not implant our Western ideas of educational models? Or they already exist there. So there's a massive, one of our inquiry questions was there's a massive gulf. The education system actually is very much based on a very colonialized, imported education system. And so there's an expectation of me wanting to learn in that way. And also inviting in, what does it mean from an Asia? You know, we were talking to some Taoist people the other day about what they mean and how they're bringing that in. So it's this bridging between the different worlds, the different contexts, and really working and managing that with the fields. And this idea of bridging, we're actually running an inquiry in Illuminate with different practitioners about what it means to bridge. And I think the book Braiding Sweetgrass is how do we braid? How do we work with these different worldviews? Is part of this work, a part of this practice. And actually one of the talks we had the other week was about tunneling. It's not just about bridging, it's also about tunneling, about how do we go underground and tunnel kind of is supported by the soil, and it has a bit more of an organic feel. So we're just playing with what are these ideas of bringing different ideas and worldviews together. And how do we work with multiple ways of knowing, different worldviews? So how do we work with this arts, the somatic, the body? You know, the body is part of the systemic. How do we work with these different ways of learning and knowing in the world? And this has implications. Oh, sorry, this is my favorite quote. Any of you have ever been to one of my talks or courses? I love this one because it joins it together. This is Meadows from her book, Thinking in Systems. The world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system, but we treat it as if it's not. As if it's divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. And a lot of our intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. And I've said this, and I'll keep saying it, that for me, at the heart of this, we can do all these practices, we can do all these processes, but if we're not paying attention to the worldview and where we're coming from and the way we think and the fundamentals of that, and that's why I do systems change. It's actually changing the way we see the world and therefore the way we act in the world from a different place, just to address some of these massive global challenges that we face. So it's what does this mean? Some themes and examples for worldview. You know, it's beyond mapping. I was talking to the MDR group, their systems practice, and they were saying, we can teach people on multi-causal diagrams, and we need some great people doing that. But if you're really trying to distribute and work with this, not everyone's going to be perfect innovators or mappers. We need people just to be using it in their day-to-day. How do we get people thinking from this worldview and applying it in different ways? So it's beyond, what traps have we got caught in terms of the quality of this practice, about what's needed and how we open it up and kind of like, and not just see ourselves as a really strongly bounded field, but a more porous field. Sorry, I've already said this, the tunneling and the bridging idea. What does depth mean in this work? What does quality mean in this world? What worldviews are we seeing in different contexts, in different places? And I think this starts to have implications about the role of the arts, the somatic, the emotional, the relational ways of knowing. And when we talk, we're talking, as I say, just because I've been doing that this week, with some funders across Southeast Asia, you know, the word impact, we had a great conversation around the word impact. We need to create impact. I just always think impact is like bashed in the face or something, you know. How do we say, well, what is impact in this systemic emerging world? Well, we can't really know, you know, or we can't know the answers to this. So how do we work with knowing in different ways about understanding these concepts that we kind of go, oh, what does innovation mean when we take different knowledge systems? Where are we innovating? What kind of innovations, the newness do we need? How do we keep going without knowing? And that's a really deep inquiry question for me. The role of unknowing and not knowing, and what's that part of it? And that sort of is part of the Meadows invited us with the world beyond paradigms, like how do we just work with a letting go of that as well? And I think that raises some really big questions for us about systems change and the practice of not knowing and unlearning and unknowing. So dissolving any notion that we have answers, plans or strategies that are watertight and universal. In fact, our strategies must be more like water itself, undermining everything that is fixed, hard, rigid, with fluidity, constant movement and evolution. So this is just what I'm seeing today, what I put together over the last few weeks, but I know it's fluid, it's moving, it's changing. The Post-it notes will move around and shift and change, but maybe today there might be a little nugget or a little drop that you're taking away and thinking about this. And for me, my questions at the bottom of my iceberg, and yours might be different, is how do we live change, the living of change? A kind of essential practice. It's not kind of, oh, it's over here as part of one of the other practices. It's almost like this deeper essence level, a way of being in the world. What does life mean for me? What gives me meaning in my world? What does it mean in my relationships with people I might be dating or seeing? Like, how do I relate to people, with friends, with colleagues? How do I learn? Learning being a base essential skill. So this isn't just practices for me. These are almost deep ideas of who I am and how I work in the world. How do I live change? So this is my question and my action inquiry that I keep coming back to about the living of change, not the trying to create systems change out there, which I think where I started about 20 years ago. For me now, the question is the living of the change. How do I live with it? What's life? What brings joy and meaning to me through difficult times that I think we are facing, and I believe we are going to continue to see more of. So to finish, my lovely colleague who works in futurists, and she's sort of almost unpicking a futurist work. This is a quote she actually just gave to me the other day. We need to follow the sources of light to get out of the darkness. And for me, the sources of light are some of these practices and some of the ideas I've just shared with you today about the little lights and sparkles of practices. If we can do this relational, this cultivating work, this deeper living change work, then I think that's where the systems practices has real hope. And that's where I get really excited about what could take us out of the issues and challenges we are in. So thank you very much. Hello. I'm Lucy.
Thank you, Anna.
My pleasure.
Okay, we're going to move right into Q&A. By the way, I'm Adela. I'm part of the London Club team. So just if you need anything today, you'll see me. But right now, we need to answer any questions. So who's got some questions? Don't be shy, not everybody at once. Brunelli's printing, okay.
I'm Peter, or Green Man on my label. I'm really interested in your final question. How do you be change? Where have you discovered in asking the question?
I think being change is one of the hardest things that we can do, because we want to hold things, don't we? We want to hold things they are, and just, I don't know, one of my things I'm struggling with at the moment is just living with kind of nothingness or silence and stopping and doing that. So I think living with change is almost going when it's really tough and kind of going with the tough waves and knowing how to surf them, not just drown. And I don't, is that just allowing yourself to have a good cry on a Saturday morning because it's been exhausting? That's me. That's what living change sometimes about. Or is it about finding and reaching out to friends who you need to have a chat with because the work is tough? So for me, living change is the journey, the process of doing that relationally and with yourself. And I think that's been a lot of what I think I'm seeing kind of emerge in the conversation as well as important practices we need to pay attention to. Does that answer your question, Green Man?
I think this is a very interesting question.
And I think ask it of yourselves. That's my answer. Like, what's your answers as well? How do you live change? What are your practices? And they're all going to be very different to each other. Oh, don't be shy. Go on. Hiya.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Ina, and yeah, my question is about power. we talk a lot about collaboration and what it means, but in my experience in my practice, I notice a lot that hierarchical structures still tend to find its place in the work that we do. So what are your thoughts about power and how we can address it in a more mindful way?
Yeah. I think there's a misnomer when we talk systemic and power. So I wrote a blog about systemic power a year or so ago, that we're trying to create flat structures or self-organizing structures. Hierarchies always exist, they always will exist. For me, it's about fluidity. So it's about moving with understanding and recognizing the positionality of power and saying, well, there is position in this, like I am your boss, you know, and how do I operate as your boss as an enabling leader? How do I step back and be able to lean in? So I think for me, power is actually, we need to shift from solid structures to ones that are fluid. And that is a lot, this is why I talked about the concept of roles. Actually, it's about role fluidity, about how do we name and recognize which role we're playing. So currently I'm the speaker, right? So I'm the knowledge holder in the room. And I've named myself as a white woman from London who is here. But what role might I play when I invite you to come in and contribute your knowledge? And how do I invite that and ask that? So there's something about, I think the first step of power is to naming it and to name what the power is in the room, and then create this psychological safety and bravery to then create spaces to have that conversation, to go under the waterline, to really have a conversation about the power dynamics, rather than just sort of, oh, we're going to create a lovely, beautiful structure and decision making, and then all the power's never going to exist, and we've got rid of hierarchies and everyone's self-organizing. And actually, it's a constant process. When new people join in collaboration, new people work, it's like, that's why I mean it's under the surface, it's the work, actually, of working with continual moving, and how do you get people into fluid places? And that for me is actually some of this work, that's why I put the quote about water, is actually working systemically, is people being able to move and have the fluidity in their roles, their ways of thinking about themselves. That's the really tough work.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Really interesting. I'm Louise, and I wanted to ask about. It was really interesting to see how much attention you pay to and all the research you're doing about what's emerging in the world at the edge of practice, all these learnings and reflections. I'm wondering what practices do you have to embed this sort of constantly emerging knowledge into your organisation and sort of stay up to date? Do you have any practices to embed this new insight and learning?
I mean, it's a philosophy, isn't it? An action inquiry philosophy is at the heart. We call, strategy is actually inquiry. So we talk about our strategy as a process of inquiry. And so we have the questions, we're doing a lot of work on equity and diversity at the moment, but we're nowhere near good enough at the moment. And it's a constant question we ask ourselves whenever we make strategic decisions. What could we be doing better here? How could we change this? What would it look like? So we have inquiry questions that then say, how do we change the structure? How do we change the D&E? Do I need to step down and not run this organization? Who would else come in? What would the process of dynamics be here? So I think it's the paying attention again to the questions. And I would say that as my Twitter handle being Anna's questions, but paying attention to this quite personal, paying attention to the questions, I really do believe creates the attention and intention to create the new future. And so I think that's the critical practice of really trying to enact those deeper questions is the hard work, actually. But it's the only kind of work that you can do, in my view. And that doesn't mean you don't need the structural changes, by the way. I'm not meaning that as a cop-out, because you then do need to make hard decisions on the structural things as well. To really say, do we take this money? Do we want to grow? Are we taking too much of the field? So they're not hard decisions. They are also, they have material impacts on the structures of what we do as well.
I'm Birney. I'm new to the system space, and I've noticed that I've really enjoyed what it's about and the stuff of it, but I've noticed there are some problems with it. I found some problems with it. What do you think are the main challenges systems thinkers or systems as a field, if it is a field, face in spreading their ideas? Because I'm not sure if it's about ideas or if it's about the individuals within the field who hold those ideas.
Yeah, I think it's the massive tension, isn't it, about porous boundaries, and that's why I sort of talk about hedges and what do we need them or not, because we need a field to feel like we can connect and talk, and we want to come to these events to find people like ourselves, and yet systems in itself is about diversity and about difference and about working with that. So for me, that is the ultimate tension, is like, should we be a field? What is our responsibility of naming something? And if we name it, does it over-rarify it and therefore exclude people? And who are we excluding in that? And I think that power dynamic is massive. And we can't leave everything to be kind of floating around, because we need something to grab hold of as people. We want to feel connected and like with people who have shared questions. And yet too much of that just creates dominance again and recreates old structures and patterns. So I think that for me, and I think I've sort of said it through this talk, but it's really difficult work, and it is the work, I think, of what we're trying to do here. And I think that it's really problematic. I play with that question. It's really problematic with this field. Like, what does it mean? People with lived experience, you know, we've had massive inquiry about working people lived experience. They're like, we don't need to start thinking systemically. We live in chaotic, systemic environments all the time. You know, so you're giving me frameworks to overstructure me when actually I need to live with it, with the change. And these are live questions and problems that, you know, so we're trying to frame our courses by saying, well, we're there for professional people who are already educated in that way, but we recognize that that's not the whole world. So it's just being clear about who you are and where you stand is also part of that. But it's a great question. I'd love to hear what you see as problematic. That being open to those questions is critical as well. I think we're nearly at time. Is that right? One more?
Hi, Anna. Thanks for your presentation, and it's very nice to see so many of you in person. Maybe just saying, I made efforts to facilitate the use of systemic tools in public policy making. And one question I often have from policymakers is, how do I measure progress? How do I measure impact from my collection, right? Because they are trapped in a system that implies they need to track that progress to get their funding.
Totally, we're all there.
You mentioned impact before. I was wondering
Yeah.
if you could say a little bit more about.
Oh, it's such an edgy. We could talk about this forever. I mean, that's the current system asking the new system to be different. You know, so how do you play the game? Like, how do you find systemic indicators that are relational and fluid, but are still playing the game of monitoring impact? How do you get them to go on an inquiry and journey with you? So, I mean, I think it's the pushing the boundaries with funders and saying, okay, we will follow your impact indicators, or we'll create our own, but actually we're also going to break free of them. And I've had many conversations with funders, well, we didn't do what we said we'd do 2 years ago, because different things have happened. And they're like, oh, well, I'm not sure you fund you again. I said, well, I prefer to go with what's emerged than not. And that's the work. That's why I think work with funders and who's setting what impact is and what we know and what is quality. That's why I use the word quality work rather than impactful work. Because that, I don't know. So I think it's the conversation that we're all having is, how do we measure systems change? It's like, I don't think we do. I mean, I don't think we can. I mean, we've got to zoom out to the whole system. The whole system's not changing. So how do we measure the quality of our interventions and the contribution? And that's why I guess inquiry is important. But it doesn't mean you can't play the systems. I still have indicators and log frames and to get the funding. And then you have the conversation with them about why that's really not very good either.
My name is Richard. So there's something he said that really resonated, so I wondered if you might expand on. He said the education system takes away the ability to think systemically.
Yeah.
Could you just say, I think I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I started off my career working in sort of shifting the education system. That was my first kind of little experiment area. I think we're born systemic thinkers. Kids learn in patterns, they learn grammar in pattern thinking, relational, they work socially, they are there. Our westernized education systems, there are different forms. The ones my kids are in, are trying to teach them words without relationship, trying to teach them spelling without context. You know, my son is dyslexic, I'm dyslexic as well. And he's struggling because he sees in patterns, he naturally sees like that. And I think they teach them about something without telling them why. I was listening to Trevor Noah's wonderful book, Born a Crime. And he was saying he was taught about the Holocaust, but as dates and facts, and he never realized that Hitler was a bad man. He was just learned facts and figures. And I just think there's, what I was listening to last night, I just think that's what our education system is doing. It's sort of teaching us facts and figures and knowledge. Well, does it matter? And if you learned about one point in history, I learned about another. Actually, it's the inquiring into the history that's important. It's that process. So I think we're born systemic. We take a lot of that out of us about how we structure our system. We don't think in skills, we think in knowledge, like transmissive knowledge. And most teachers I've ever come across don't really want to work like that. But we want the metrics of educational systems to say, you know, and it was born in a Victorian era, which was we wanted to put people through a process to go and work in a factory. It was a mechanistic format, and we haven't changed it. I left working in the education system because it was painful. Someday, I'm sort of going back by setting up my own school, but I know I need to go back in there, challenge academia, challenge education systems, because actually there's a root cause there that needs unpicking. Thank you. So before I leave the stage, Post-it notes on the wall, please add them, critique, challenge. I will collect them, I will look at them, I really want them. So please invite you to do that as part of the inquiry, and hopefully you continue the threads and ideas through the day. Sorry, just a last minute there.
Thank you so much.